We are counting down the 15 black music groups from the 1970s whose stories took the most tragic turns, ranking everything from devastating plane crashes and sudden deaths to legal battles, family splits, and disappearances that erase legacies. From high-flying acts struck by tragedy at the peak of fame to chart toppers undone by heartbreak, violence, and mystery, every spot on this list is earned by the gravity of what really happened behind the scenes. Which case ranks as the most tragic of all, and what shocking fate sets the countdown in motion? Let us begin with number 15. The Bar-Kays were riding high in the late 1960s, backing Otis Redding on tour and scoring with their own breakout hit, Soul Finger. Their sound blended Memphis soul with the raw energy of Stax Records, and as teenagers, they had already become the house band for a generation's most electrifying performers. But on December 10, 1967, everything changed in an instant. That morning, a small Beechcraft plane carrying Otis Redding and 6 others, including most of the Bar-Kays, crashed into the icy waters of Lake Monona near Madison, Wisconsin. The weather was brutal, heavy fog and freezing temperatures. 4 members of the Bar-Kays, Phelan Jones, Ronnie Caldwell, Carl Cunningham, and Jimmy King, were killed, along with their friend Otis Redding and the pilot. Only trumpeter Ben Cauley survived, pulled from the wreckage clinging to a seat cushion. Bassist James Alexander, who had flown separately, was left to piece together what remained of the band. The loss was staggering. In the aftermath, Alexander and Cauley rebuilt the Bar-Kays from the ground up, recruiting new members and forging ahead through grief. By the early 1970s, the Bar-Kays had transformed themselves into a powerhouse funk band, delivering hits like Shake Your Rump to the Funk and Too Hot to Stop. The tragedy of Lake Monona never faded, but it became part of the Bar-Kays' legend, story of survival and rebirth, shadowed by the memory of lives and music lost too soon. By the mid-1970s, the OJs stood at the heart of the Philadelphia soul explosion. Their voices powered anthems like Love Train, Backstabbers, and For the Love of Money, filling dance floors and radio charts across America. The group's blend of tight harmonies and social commentary made them a defining act of the era, and under the direction of Gamble and Huff at Philadelphia International Records, they seemed unstoppable. But behind the platinum records, a quiet tragedy was unfolding. William Powell, the group's original lead tenor, began to fall seriously ill during the group's busiest years. By 1975, Powell was forced to step away from touring and recording, his health declining with little public explanation. Doctors diagnosed him with cancer, and despite treatment, his condition worsened over the next 2 years. On May 26, 1977, William Powell died at just 35 years old. His passing came at a time when the OJs were still riding high on the charts, and the shock rippled through the soul community. For fans and fellow musicians, the loss was deeply personal because Powell's voice had been a cornerstone of the group's sound since their earliest days in Canton, Ohio. Philadelphia International released statements mourning his death, while Eddie Levert and Walter Williams pressed on as a trio, joined by Sammy Strain. The OJs continued to record and tour, but the absence of Powell left a permanent gap in their harmonies. His story became a reminder that, even at the height of fame, tragedy could strike from within, cutting down a talent in his prime. The Temptations carved their name into the soul of American music with hits like My Girl and Papa Was a Rolling Stone. Their harmonies shaped the Motown sound, and by the early 1970s, they were household names, selling out arenas and topping charts year after year. But behind the polished routines and bright spotlights, the pressure never let up. Endless touring, constant lineup changes, and the weight of expectation wore on each member. For Paul Williams, one of the founding voices and original choreographer, the strain became unbearable. On August 17, 1973, Detroit police found Paul Williams dead in a parked car on the city's west side. He was only 34. The official report ruled it a suicide. Friends and family described a man battling deep depression, struggling to keep up with the band's relentless pace while managing health problems and financial stress. Williams had left the touring lineup 2 years earlier, but the group's schedule and fame had already taken their toll. Motown biographies and police records detail how Williams, once the heart of the group's choreography and stage presence, slipped further from the spotlight as his personal battles mounted. The news stunned the music world. Within days, the Temptations restructured their lineup and returned to the road. Williams's death rarely made headlines outside Detroit, but for those who knew his story, it stood as a stark reminder of the mental and emotional costs behind the music. The Temptations pressed on, but the loss of Paul Williams left a shadow that never fully lifted, a tragedy woven into the very fabric of their legacy. By the early 1970s, the Spinners had become a defining voice of soul, sending songs like I'll Be Around and Could It Be, I'm Falling in Love, climbing the charts. Their success owed much to the soaring vocals of Felipe Wynne, whose improvisational style and stage presence gave the group's signature spark. But in 1977, Wynne left the Spinners to pursue a solo career, and the group's momentum began to wane. Without his creative force, their chart performance slipped, and the magic of their classic era proved hard to recapture. Wynne's journey after leaving the group was marked by both ambition and hardship. He recorded solo albums, collaborated with George Clinton's Parliament-Funkadelic, and toured relentlessly, hoping to carve out a new legacy. Yet the pressures of the industry, along with the instability that often followed artists who struck out on their own, weighed heavily. The Spinners, meanwhile, struggled to adapt, cycling through new lead singers and searching for the chemistry that once made them unstoppable. On July 14, 1984, tragedy struck during a performance in Oakland, California. Wynne collapsed on stage from a heart attack, dying at just 43 years old. The loss sent shockwaves through the soul community. For many, his death symbolized not just the end of a singular voice, but the fading of an era. The Spinners continued to perform and record, but the absence of Wynne's improvisational genius left a permanent void. His passing turned a chapter of soul music into memory, and fans were left to wonder what might have been if the voice that once lifted a generation had not been silenced so soon. War's music defined a generation. Funk, Latin rhythms, and soul were woven into hits like Lowrider, The Cisco Kid, and Why Can't We Be Friends? Their sound was everywhere in the 1970s, a soundtrack for city streets and California sunshine. The band's lineup was a tapestry of backgrounds, but saxophonist Charles Miller stood at its heart. His solos brought grit and joy to War's biggest tracks, and his stage presence was magnetic. On June 14, 1980, that presence was stolen. After leaving a party in Los Angeles, Miller was attacked and stabbed during a robbery. Paramedics rushed him to the hospital, but he was pronounced dead hours later. The Los Angeles Police Department opened a homicide investigation, but the case remains unsolved. News of Miller's murder barely made the front page, lost in a city used to violence. For War, the loss was devastating. Charles Miller had just turned 41. In the aftermath, the band struggled to fill the void. Miller's saxophone had shaped their sound, and his death fractured the group's chemistry. Legal battles over the War name soon followed, splintering the original lineup into rival factions. Some members formed the Lowrider Band, while others continued under the War banner. The music survived, but the unity that powered their greatest years was gone. Charles Miller's murder stands as a chilling reminder of how quickly violence can end a legacy, leaving only echoes and unanswered questions. Harold Melvin and the Blue Notes helped define the Philadelphia soul sound. lighting up the charts in the early 1970s with hits like If You Don't Know Me By Now and The Love I Lost. At the front stood Teddy Pendergrass, whose voice and charisma turned the group into headliners and made him a solo star in the making. By 1977, Pendergrass had launched his own career, selling out arenas across the country and earning a reputation as one of R&B's most electrifying performers. Everything changed on March 18, 1982. Driving his Rolls-Royce through Philadelphia's Germantown neighborhood, Pendergrass lost control of the car, which struck a tree and flipped. The crash left him with a severe spinal cord injury, paralyzing him from the chest down. News of the accident raced through the city and across the world. Doctors at Thomas Jefferson University Hospital worked through the night, but the damage was irreversible. The man whose voice once soared above packed stadiums would never walk again. Pendergrass faced years of recovery and adjustment. He returned to music, recording new albums and performing from a wheelchair, but the accident ended his run as a dynamic stage presence. Instead, he became an advocate for people with spinal cord injuries, using his platform to raise awareness and funds for research. The crash did not claim his life, but it cut short a career that had only just begun to reach its full potential. For fans of Harold Melvin and the Blue Notes and soul music everywhere, the tragedy stands as a reminder of how quickly fate can intervene, even for those who seem unstoppable. Earth, Wind, and Fire soared through the 1970s, reshaping soul, funk, and pop with an energy that felt unstoppable. Led by Maurice White, the band turned out classics like September, Shining Star, and Fantasy, filling arenas and airwaves across the world. Their live shows became legendary, horns blazing, costumes dazzling, every note locked in tight. Maurice White was the architect behind it all, blending gospel, jazz, and African rhythms into a sound that defined an era and broke genre boundaries. But by the mid-1980s, something was changing behind the scenes. Maurice White began to notice tremors in his hands and stiffness that made performing harder. Doctors diagnosed him with Parkinson's disease, a progressive neurological disorder. He kept the news private at first, determined to lead the group through studio sessions and world tours. Over time, the symptoms grew harder to hide. White's movement slowed, and the physical demands of the stage became too much. In 1994, Maurice White made the decision to step back from touring. He announced his retirement from live performance, though he continued to guide Earth, Wind, and Fire in the studio and as executive producer. The band pressed on, honoring his vision and keeping the music alive for new generations. White's public appearances grew rare, but his influence remained everywhere. In arrangements, in the band's signature harmonies, in the way they carried themselves on stage. Maurice White passed away in 2016 at age 74. His journey with Parkinson's lasted over 3 decades, quietly reshaping the band's path. Earth, Wind, and Fire never stopped performing, but the absence of their founder was felt in every show. White's legacy endures, not just in the hits, but in the resilience of a group that faced illness and loss with dignity, and in the generations of artists who still draw inspiration from his sound. Parliament-Funkadelic was more than a band, it was an empire of sound, a sprawling collective that redefined funk in the 1970s under George Clinton's wild vision. Their records from Mothership Connection to One Nation, Under a Groove, filled stadiums and dance floors, earning gold albums and a loyal following. But behind the cosmic costumes and wild stage shows, the business foundation was crumbling. By the late 1980s, Parliament-Funkadelic's royalties were frozen as lawsuits erupted over unpaid earnings and catalog rights. Bridgeport Music, a company that acquired much of the P-Funk publishing, became the focus of years-long litigation, with musicians fighting just to access the money their music had earned. The freeze left members struggling financially, even as their songs were sampled by a new generation of hip-hop artists. The blows did not stop at the bank. On December 23, 1992, the group lost Eddie Hazel, the guitarist whose solos had powered classics like Maggot Brain. Hazel died of liver failure at just 42 after years of health battles and hard living. His loss shattered the creative core of P-Funk. With the legal battles dragging on and Hazel gone, the collective's momentum stalled. Many members faced poverty, and the unity that once electrified the stage dissolved into more lawsuits and bitter disputes over the rights to their own music. The Parliament-Funkadelic story became a cautionary tale how creative brilliance can be undone by financial mismanagement and exploitation. Even as the mothership legacy lives on, the scars of those lost royalties and Hazel's absence are still felt by those who built the funk from the ground up. Between 1971 and 1974, the Stylistics were everywhere, on the radio, on television, and at the top of the charts. Their sound, defined by Russell Tompkins Jr.'s soaring falsetto and the lush arrangements of producer Tom Bell, produced an unbroken string of hits, including Betcha by Golly Wow, You Make Me Feel Brand New, and Break Up to Make Up. 5 singles reached the U.S. top 10 in just 3 years. The group's albums sold in the millions, and their ballads became staples of the era's soul playlists. But in 1974, everything changed offstage. Tom Bell, the creative force behind their signature sound, ended his collaboration with the group after creative and business disagreements. Without Bell's songwriting and production, the Stylistics struggled to maintain their momentum. The next round of singles failed to chart in the U.S. top 10, and the group's presence on radio playlists faded almost overnight. Interviews with band members and Bell himself reveal a sense of loss, of direction, of chemistry, of the magic that had made their early records timeless. The industry's decision to separate the band from their producer was driven by contracts and shifting priorities, but the fallout was felt most deeply in the music itself. The Stylistics continued to perform and record, especially finding audiences overseas, but the era of relentless chart success was over. Their fate stands as a different kind of tragedy, not sudden or violent, but a slow unraveling caused by an industry that often treats creative partnerships as disposable. For a group that once seemed destined for permanent stardom, the loss of their producer marked a quiet but decisive end to their golden age. The Chi-Lites rose out of Chicago's South Side, harmonizing their way into the heart of 1970s soul. With Eugene Records' voice leading the charge, they delivered classics like Have You Seen Her and Oh Girl, earning gold records and international acclaim. But as their songs topped the charts, a different kind of storm was gathering, one that would not make headlines but would quietly fracture the group's future. By the mid-1980s, the Chi-Lites' catalog became the center of a prolonged legal war. Multiple former members began touring under the Chi-Lites name, each staking a claim to the group's legacy. Court filings from the late 1980s and early 1990s show a tangled web of lawsuits over trademark rights, unpaid royalties, and the authority to represent the group. Injunctions were filed to stop rival lineups from using the name. At times, there were 3 or more competing versions of the Chi-Lites performing in different cities, confusing fans and promoters alike. The legal infighting took a heavy toll. Royalties from their biggest hits were tied up in litigation, delaying reissues and draining income that should have supported the original members and their families. The group's reputation suffered as lawsuits dragged on, and the public struggled to recognize which act was the real Chi-Lites. Instead of celebrating their legacy, the members found themselves locked in courtrooms, watching the value of their music erode. The Chi-Lites' story became a cautionary tale, not of sudden loss, but of a legacy slowly chipped away by legal battles, leaving behind fractured memories where unity once stood. By the early 1970s, the Isley Brothers stood as one of the era's most powerful musical dynasties. Their run of hits, That Lady, Fight the Power, and Between the Sheets spanned genres and generations, and their family bond was at the heart of it all. The group's core, brothers Ronald, Rudolph, and O'Kelly, had built a brand that seemed unbreakable, especially after welcoming younger siblings Ernie and Marvin and brother-in-law Chris Jasper into the fold. Together, they created a sound that was both timeless and fiercely modern, blending gospel roots with funk, soul, and rock. But as the 1980s approached, the unity that fueled their success began to unravel. Disputes over publishing credits and control of the group's lucrative catalog sparked tension behind closed doors. Legal filings and interviews from the period reveal a growing divide over songwriting royalties and business decisions. In 1984, the Isley Brothers Corporation formally split. The original trio, Ronald, Rudolph, and O'Kelly, retained the classic group name, while Ernie, Marvin, and Chris Jasper launched their own act, Isley Jasper Isley. Each side began touring and recording separately, dividing not just the catalog but the family itself. The impact was immediate. The brand that once commanded arenas now appeared in competing versions, confusing fans and promoters. Revenue from publishing and touring dropped as the Isley name lost its singular power. The split also set off a string of lawsuits over catalog rights and royalties, draining resources that once fueled new music. For a band whose identity was rooted in family, the fracture was more than business. It was a quiet tragedy that diminished one of Black music's great dynasties at the height of its influence. In the 1970s, the Jackson family transformed from local Indiana hopefuls into a global phenomenon. The Jackson 5, with their explosive Motown debut and a string of #1 hits, captured the imagination of millions. Their story seemed charmed. 5 brothers, led by Michael's unmistakable voice, moving from I Want You Back in ABC to stadium tours and television specials. But behind the dazzling choreography and perfect harmonies, the group's rise was shadowed by pain that would only come to light decades later. As the years passed, stories began to surface about the relentless pressures inside the Jackson household. Allegations of emotional and physical abuse by their father, Joe Jackson, followed the family into the 1990s and the 2000s. Interviews, court documents, and memoirs from multiple siblings painted a picture of children forced into adulthood, rehearsing for hours under threat of punishment, and living in fear of disappointing the man who managed every detail of their lives. The public watched as Michael, once the group's bright-eyed youngest, became the most famous solo artist in the world, and also its most scrutinized. Tabloid storms erupted over his changing appearance, lawsuits, and accusations that would haunt him until the end. Family rifts played out on talk shows and in courtrooms, deepening the sense of tragedy that clung to the Jacksons' legacy. On June 25, 2009, Michael Jackson died suddenly at age 50. The news stunned the world, but for the family, it was the final, devastating blow. Michael's passing forced a new reckoning with the group's history, a legacy built on brilliance but also on scars that never fully healed. The Jackson story, once a symbol of hope and possibility, became a cautionary tale about fame, family, and the hidden costs of stardom. The Dramatics powered through the 1970s with a string of R&B hits, What You See Is What You Get, In the Rain, and Shake It Well, becoming a fixture on soul radio and the national touring circuit. Their voices and harmonies were unmistakable, and their records kept climbing the charts well into the decade. But in recent years, a story has circulated online that in 1977, just after landing a $1 million contract, the Dramatics suffered a devastating van crash on tour, a crash that, according to these accounts, claimed lives and changed the group's fate forever. Yet, when you look for evidence in official records, the trail goes cold. No police reports, no newspaper clippings, no trade press obituaries from 1977 document such an accident. The Dramatics discography shows no sudden gap in releases or touring, and their lineup remained intact through the late 1970s. Interviews with surviving members, label histories, and fan-maintained timelines all recount the group's real tragedies, like the 1967 Algiers motel killings, but make no mention of a fatal van crash a decade later. This silence in the historical record raises important questions about how music history gets remembered and retold. In cases like this, verifying claims means combing through local microfilm archives, searching state police records, and reaching out to band members or their families for first-hand accounts. Until such evidence surfaces, the story of a 1977 Dramatics van crash remains unconfirmed, a reminder of the need for careful research in separating myth from fact. For now, the group's most documented tragedy is the loss they suffered during the Detroit uprising, not an unverified accident on the highway. The Originals carved out their place in Motown's golden era with smooth harmonies and a string of soulful ballads. Baby, I'm For Real and the Bells, both produced by Marvin Gaye, soared up the charts between 1969 and 1970, giving the group its biggest hits and a taste of national fame. Their blend of Detroit gospel roots and polished Motown production offered something distinct, earning them steady radio play and a loyal following. But as Motown's headquarters shifted from Detroit to Los Angeles in 1971, the ground began to shift beneath the Originals' feet. The move was not just about geography, it redirected the label's attention toward new pop crossovers, film projects, and acts that fit the emerging Los Angeles sound. The Originals, deeply tied to Detroit studio musicians and songwriting teams, soon found themselves without the same creative or promotional backing. Marvin Gaye, once their most powerful advocate, was drawn into his own West Coast projects, leaving the group without a champion inside the label. Release schedules show that the Originals kept recording for Motown through the early and mid-1970s, but none of their later singles matched the chart success of their Detroit-era hits. Their albums slipped quietly into the catalog, with little national marketing or radio push. As Motown's priorities shifted, the Originals faded from the spotlight, not through scandal or catastrophe, but through a slow withdrawal of support that left their work buried in the label's archives. Today, their legacy is obscured, a casualty of industry decisions that erase not just a group, but a chapter of soul music history. Soul Train Gang arrived in the mid-1970s with the backing of Don Cornelius, the visionary behind Soul Train. The group was formed not from the show's famous dancers, but as a vocal act meant to ride the wave of the Soul Train brand into the music charts. Their debut, produced by Cornelius and Dick Griffey, featured lush arrangements from Philadelphia's MFSB musicians and aimed for crossover success. In 1975, Soul Train Gang released the album Don Cornelius Presents the Soul Train Gang, hoping to capture the same magic that launched other Soul Train-affiliated acts. But soon after, stories began to circulate about a devastating bus crash, rumors of a fatal accident just as the group was poised for a breakthrough, followed by whispers of wrongful death lawsuits and a hasty cover-up. Yet, when you dig into the record, the trail disappears. There are no newspaper articles from 1975 reporting a Soul Train Gang crash. No court dockets list wrongful death cases involving the group, Don Cornelius, or Soul Train Productions. Trade magazines like Billboard and Jet, which chronicled even minor incidents in black music, make no mention of a crash, a lawsuit, or a sudden loss of group members. The group's discography continues uninterrupted through the mid-1970s, with no sign of a career cut short by tragedy. Interviews with surviving members and retrospectives on the Soul Train legacy focus on business challenges, shifting trends, and the group's quiet fade from the spotlight, not a catastrophic accident. The silence in both the legal and press archives raises questions about how such a story took hold. Was there an unreported minor accident that grew into legend? Did fans conflate the group's slow disappearance with a hidden tragedy? Or is this a case of myth filling the gaps left by an industry that often moved on without explanation? What is clear is that for Soul Train Gang, the real mystery is not a lost lawsuit or a buried headline. It is how a story with no paper trail became the stuff of internet countdowns. Until new evidence surfaces, the tale of the 1975 Soul Train Gang bus crash remains unverified, a reminder of how easily music history can slip from fact into folklore. For those who still remember their songs, the call is clear, the truth deserves to be found, and the record set straight. Across all 15 stories, one pattern stands out. The music industry's success often hid a dangerous lack of protection for Black bands. Behind every hit were relentless touring schedules, grueling pressures, and systemic neglect, risks amplified by inequality. These tragedies aren't just cautionary tales from the past. They reveal how easily brilliance can be lost when safety and justice are afterthoughts. Remembering these bands means demanding better for artists today. Which group story struck you most? Share below.